This is not March. This is February 2nd, 2019, and you're Lawrence Woods, or would you prefer Larry Woods? Yeah, Larry Woods, and we're going to be doing an interview on your time with Vietnam and that sort of thing. So I guess we'll start off kind of at the basic beginnings with kind of what unit did you serve in, like how you joined the military, all that stuff, like your basic like establishing stuff.
I always hear people talk about military families, and I always thought that meant that they had people that spent their lives in the military.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, that's become something different. And military family means that you have multiple members of the family that serve in the military to me.
Uh-huh.
So my father served in World War II in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
My older brother served in the Air Force. He got out a year before I went in.
Yeah.
And I went into enlisted in the Air Force in 1966 and was in through 1970. 1966, we were in the midst of the Cold War, and we were also then in the midst of a buildup in Vietnam.
Okay.
So both things happened at once.
Yeah.
So I went into the Air Force, and they asked what kind of job you wanted. And I had requested pararescue, air traffic control, or photo mapping.
Okay.
I thought they would be really cool.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of the form it said, would you accept security police? And I said, no. So I became a security policeman. Later on I found out that the security police had been in the Air Force, were said to be the light infantry of the Air Force.
Okay.
Because we were the only ones that carried weapons, really. So in '66, after I got out of basic, they sent me directly to Grand Forks, North Dakota, and I received on-the-job training because the technical school that I should have gone to was full because they were sending so many troops to Vietnam as they were building up air bases that they needed to replenish the number of people, and they needed many more than they had.
Yeah.
So I ended up going on-the-job training rather than receiving formal training.
Yeah.
And in North Dakota, it was a Strategic Air Command, a SAC base. And what that meant is they were the nuclear weapons base. So we had B-52s that were in the air constantly with nuclear weapons, and we had 150 Minutemen II missiles with nuclear weapons with multiple warheads on each.
Oh wow.
And that was part of the deterrent for Russia.
Yeah.
For the Cold War. And I spent 14 months in North Dakota, and then got orders that I was going to Vietnam because they needed more troops. We were sent to Texas for combat training for 2 weeks, and then came back and then received my orders to Vietnam.
Okay.
And in October of 1967, I went to Tuy Hoa Air Base in South Vietnam, and I spent October 67 through October 68 at Tuy Hoa.
Okay.
And Tuy Hoa is on the South China Sea. It's considered 2 corps. They divided Vietnam into 4 corps.
Okay.
And they use Roman numerals to designate them. So the first one was always referred to, you'll hear it referred to as I Corps, because Roman numeral 1 looks like an I.
Yeah.
So that was I Corps, and that was primarily Marines, although there was an air base, Da Nang Air Base in I Corps, and that was a combination Air Force and Marines.
Yeah.
And then 2 Corps, you had along the coastline, there was Quy Nhon, Tuy Hoa, Nha Trang, Cam Ranh Bay, Phan Rang, and in the farther to the west, you had Pleiku in the middle of the Central Highlands.
Okay.
And then you had 3 Corps, which was down near Saigon, and there was Ben Hoa, Ben Thuy, Ben Hoa and Tan Son Nhut. Tan Son Nhut was the big air base at Saigon, and that's where the MACV headquarters, Military Assistance Command Vietnam.
Okay.
That's where the headquarters was. That's where General Westmoreland was stationed.
Okay.
And that was the biggest air base. and then there was one air base, Bin Tui, which was in 4 Corps, and that was the Mekong Delta.
Mhm.
So that's where I spent my time, which was at Tuiwa in 2 Corps.
Okay. Now, with to backtrack a little bit, when you filled out that initial form,
Mhm.
do you feel like if it hadn't been for when you joined and all that, you would have gotten the assignments you had asked for, or like
Don't know.
kind of tough to say?
Yeah, they needed that. They fill the jobs that they need.
That's
and,
true. Mhm.
And the problem was, up until that time period, you needed, a number of security police on air bases,
Mhm.
but those numbers might be 30, 40, you know,
Yeah.
maybe a few more than that. Depends on what the mission was.
Mhm.
If it was a mission like a SAC base, you needed more because you had the B-52s, you had the missiles, and you had base security.
Yeah.
But you still maybe have 60 or so, 70 tops, security police.
Mhm.
But in Vietnam, we had 35 bunkers, 15 towers. Each bunker was supposed to have 2 people. And then you had walking patrols, and then you had 3 shifts.
Mhm.
So you needed 150, 200 security police on each base. Well, they didn't have them.
Mhm.
So they needed to fill those, so a lot of people were getting plugged into those positions.
Yeah.
Normally what happens when you go in, you go to training, and you'll be in training for anywhere between 6 months to 8 months
Mhm.
to be trained in all the various, like I should have been trained on all the base security, security procedures, regular police procedures that you would normally see in civilian police,
Yeah.
as well as security. Instead, I got sent directly to North Dakota and was trained strictly in security
Okay.
because that's what was needed.
Yeah, they didn't really. They didn't have the luxury of having the full time they
Exactly.
would normally work with. It was kind
Exactly.
of
And even combat training was compressed to 2 weeks of intense combat training.
how much is it normally? For
Oh,
that? It
well,
would
they didn't have combat training for the Air Force.
Okay.
Army, it would be multiple months.
Yeah.
But we shared, when we went to Texas, we shared the Army base. We went to Fort Bullis,
Mhm.
where we had machine gun training and did night training, doing search and destroy, that sort of training for that, even though we didn't, my base didn't end up doing that. But that's where we ended up being trained at.
Yeah. Okay, and then how many years were you? How many years were you actually in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam for 1 full year,
Okay, and then how long were you in the service in total?
4.
Okay.
Yeah, military enlistment in the Air Force was 4 years. It would have been 4 years exactly, except at the end of the time period, because they were still in need of people, because in 1968 still was the big push.
Mhm.
If you weren't going to re-enlist, then they were giving you early discharge
Mhm.
so that they could bring new people in, and there was money in the budget to bring in new people. Plus, it was easier to bring in somebody as an airman basic, which is somebody with no stripes,
Yeah,
rather than a sergeant who was getting paid more.
that's true.
Now, it wasn't a lot more, but nonetheless, it was paid more. And so I ended up getting out in March of '66, or '68 rather. Yeah, sorry. Went in May of '66, got out in March of '70, and it would have been should have been May of '70, but I got 2 months early. They tacked that on to inactive reserve.
Okay.
So I still did my full 6 years, including 2 years in active reserve. I just had an extra 2 months that way.
Okay, cool. And then when you were initially deployed to Vietnam, what was your understanding of like the United States mission there?
Well,
Like
they
how
didn't,
did
they didn't tell us a mission.
it just you kind of like what? So I mean, you definitely you had some exposure through the news. I'm assuming.
Oh yeah,
Like, did you have an idea of what you were getting into?
No.
What was involved?
no. You knew that there was a conflict going on.
Mhm.
You would read about and be told about the communist, the fear of communist and the domino theory of
Mhm. Yeah.
countries falling, etc. But they didn't give you a real background, at least for us.
Yeah.
So we were just the basic the training that we got, the combat training,
Mhm.
was basically weapons training for the most part. They
Yeah.
taught us. I mean, we had been trained with we used an M16 when we first got in basic training and qualified.
Yeah.
But when I went to North Dakota, all the M16s had been sent to Vietnam, so I was issued a 30 caliber carbine, an M1 carbine,
Yeah.
which was an automatic weapon, but it was not an M16. And then we carried a 38 revolver. So that was my basic weapons in North Dakota. When we trained for Vietnam, we had to train for everything else. So we trained with M16s, M60 machine guns, because that was going to be my weapon of choice, or my weapon to use. We used the rocket launcher, or the grenade launchers, and the XM148 and the M79 grenade launcher. We learned claymore mines, grenades, all of those sorts of things.
Now
to
then,
be prepared.
since you were doing security detail on base, what did you actually interact with in terms, like, what weapons did you guys actually use on a day-to-day basis, like
In North Dakota,
maintaining and all that?
yeah, in North Dakota, and then when I went to Delaware afterwards, it was basically a 38 caliber revolver, and if you had a rifle, you would carry the M1 carbine. When I went to Vietnam, we were primarily security on the perimeter, on a bunker,
Yeah.
and you would use an M60 machine gun and an M16, and then you had slap flares. Some of the bunkers had claymore mines in front of them. And that was primarily the weapon. So the weapon that I used most in Vietnam was an M60 machine gun.
Yeah. Okay, and then this kind of connects to the first one. So you went in without a lot of kind of the, how do I put this, the bigger picture sort of. How much of that had you picked up by the time you left over the course of that 1 year? Like, did you better understand what was going on, or
You read Stars and Stripes, which was the military newspaper.
okay?
There was a TV station, except I worked Tiger Flight, which meant I worked nights.
Okay.
So we went on duty during the night. I didn't work during the daytime at all.
Yeah.
So we didn't really see television.
Yeah.
And the TV that we had was one station, and it was Armed Forces Vietnam, which was basically canned stuff. You sometimes heard some radio through Armed Forces Vietnam, and that's the Adrian Conauer, the Good Morning Vietnam.
Yeah.
That was Armed Forces Radio Vietnam.
Okay.
Now, he was there before I was, so that whole, his time period and listening to him was something that I never got to do, because that was before I was there.
Yeah.
And he was in the Air Force, by the way. But we would hear some news that way, and you would pick things up. But pretty much it was more what the action was going on, because every night we would go on duty, there's something in security police called guard mount,
Okay.
which is a reverse of what it actually means, which is mounting of the guard.
Okay.
And if you remember the old TV series, Hill Street Blues, and there were others like it, you always see the police officers in the station with a sergeant in front of them giving them their orders for the night. Normally telling them, be on the lookout for so-and-so, we think we have this kind of activity going on,
Yeah.
we have a burglary ring, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, in Vietnam, it was intelligence reports.
Okay.
So we have intelligence that says VC are mounting, they're heading this. We expect this to go on in our area. We expect this to be going on in other areas. So you would get a basic intelligence report before you went out. So you would hear what was going on. And then you would also get word of certain other actions. Because when I first got there, it was before the Tet Offensive. And the siege at Khe Sanh was going on. And our planes were supporting the Marines at Khe Sanh.
Yeah.
So they were part of the 130s that were dropping supplies at Khe Sanh, and our F-100s were flying close-in air support for the Marines. And so we would hear about what was going on at Khe Sanh. There was action taking place with the 173rd, who had been stationed south of us, and they had been involved in a disastrous battle at Dak To, where a Marine pilot dropped a 250-pound bomb, and it went about 650 yards where it shouldn't have, and it exploded directly over the Marines. And our fighters also was part of that, although that was dropped by a Marine pilot. But we would hear about those things, and we knew about some of what was going on, but we weren't getting any history, and we weren't watching the nightly news.
Yeah. Well, and like
So we weren't seeing that.
yeah, it was almost from the sound of it kind of what you need to know.
Yeah.
And then like efficient. You know, you don't need to like go into
Right.
detail to beyond those basic things. So, then moving on to question 4. Those obviously Vietnam was one of those sort of colonial connections there between France and the Vietnamese people. How do you view the French influence on the Vietnamese people? And then like how much do you feel that eventually changed the United States' role there? Because like I know the French were a large part of the reason why we were there in the first place, at least to my understanding initially.
Well, I've got real strong feelings there, and this comes from 50 years later, and doing an awful lot of research, and also going back to Vietnam and talking to people. The Vietnamese are a very friendly people. They are a very forgiving people. They've been occupied for over 1,000 years, first by the Chinese, the Japanese, and then the French came in. And the French, for over 80 years, had colonial rule. Vietnamese had a mixed reaction to the French. On the one hand, they felt grateful that France built them up economically in terms of their infrastructure, building buildings and putting in telephones and other kind of things. But they took all of their natural resources, they took the money, they aligned themselves with some of the wealthiest families who became extremely rich while the peasantry was taken advantage of completely. Michelin in particular had rubber plants, and they were a big money driver. They were making millions and millions off of Vietnam. The Vietnamese wanted independence, and they've been trying to get independence for years, and the French weren't having it. Ho Chi Minh said that the French built more prisons than they did schools, so he was extremely unhappy over that.
Yeah.
In 1940, during World War II, the Japanese came in, and the French, who had been taken over by the Germans, had a Vichy government, which meant they had an underground government, but were pretty much taken over by the Germans. When Japan came into Vietnam, they basically handed the country over to Japan. And Japan took over Vietnam, and they had always been brutal to the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh had been trying to unify and come up with a free country for years. During the latter part of the war, the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services of the U.S., had troops who were in Hanoi and also in China. And American fighters were being shot down. They were trying to get intelligence, so they went to the French, and the French didn't give it to them. So they had no way of getting intelligence. So they got involved with a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, of all people, who aligned himself with the United States government. His Viet Minh would help to rescue downed American pilots and spirit them back to Vietnam. And they worked together with the United States. He had been trying since 1917, when he tried to see Woodrow Wilson, to get Wilson to acknowledge Vietnam as a free country, and the United States ignored it. Through 1940 to 1945, he helped the United States by rescuing pilots and helping. The OSS, on the other hand, helped the Viet Minh and trained the Viet Minh. So if you think of it, the U.S. trained what then became the NVA. Now, there was a gentleman who was a lieutenant colonel. His name was, and I'm going to give you his whole name because it's one of the more fascinating names in history. His name was Archimedes Leonidas Attilio Patti, P-A-T-T-I.
That's quite the name.
But I suggest that you go online and bring up a video clip, a YouTube clip of an interview he did for public television back in the 50s, I think it was, where he talks about doing intelligence reports that he sent on to the United States. He worked with Ho Chi Minh, who wanted independence. He was advocating that the United States support his endeavors to become a free country.
Yeah.
FDR did not want colonialism to take place again. He wanted to end colonialism.
Yeah.
So he did not want the French to go back in when the war ended and become a colonial power in Vietnam. However, Archimedes Patty sent to his reckoning over 15 reports supporting Ho Chi Minh. Later on, he says he was back at the Pentagon and he tried to find whatever happened to those reports because he felt he couldn't be, that somebody would have read those and not taken some actions. He found out that those reports were still in the same envelopes in a file cabinet. They had never been read. Now, just a footnote to history, the secretary who received those turned out to be a rather famous chef. And she was the French chef, Julia Childs, who worked for the CIA.
Oh.
Now, if you listen to Archimedes Patty, it's his argument that the United States never had an enemy in Vietnam. They only had an enemy at the end of the war. Now, first off, in 1945, the war ends. Ho Chi Minh goes to Bang Dao Plaza in Hanoi. And I'm going to read exactly what he said.
Yeah.
This is his Declaration of Independence of Vietnam from the start. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples of the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. The Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791, on the rights of man and the citizens also state, all men are born free and with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. Those are undeniable truths. He wrote that. Archimedes Patty corrected it to make sure the language was correct, to quote the Constitution. This man wanted a country that was going to emulate the United States.
Yeah.
The difference is, and the reason the later on he was vilified, is they called him a communist. He was much more of a socialist. He wanted freedom. He wanted freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. He wanted people to have the right to vote. But instead, he also didn't want the richest 1%, which we hear about today a lot, to control everything. He felt that the peasant classes had been ignored, and this is where his socialist bent came in, that they should be able to share in the fruits of their labor more equitably.
Yeah.
That went against the form of democracy in the United States, which is based on a capitalist society. He would have based really a very similar kind of a democratic society, but on a more socialist model.
Yeah.
The problem is FDR died. Truman was influenced by his advisors to back Charles de Gaulle, and instead the French moved back in. Now, they moved in, and for about 8 years, they again took over colonial rule in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh fought them.
Yeah.
And in 1954, Ho Chi Minh mounted the siege at Dien Bien Phu, which kicked the French out.
Yeah.
Now, when they kicked them out in July of 1954, just like in Korea, and this ties into your other part of your course, but just like in Korea, the United States, China, France, USSR, and Britain, what do they have to do with those countries?
Yeah.
They made, through the Geneva Accords, a division at the 17th parallel. Sound familiar with Korea?
Yeah.
They had a division. However, It was called a temporary division, with elections to be held for a free, democratic Vietnam within 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Ho Chi Minh signed it because within 2 years the people were going to be allowed to vote.
Yes.
They never allowed the vote. It never took place, and as a result, we ended up having and created an enemy because Ho Chi Minh had no choice because the United States abandoned him. He had no choice but to look for allies, and the only allies he could find were China and Russia.
Yeah.
He never embraced either form of their form of communism. The Vietnamese people to this day don't trust and don't like either Russia or the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
China says that Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are the tail of the dragon, that they belong to China.
Mm-hmm.
So the Vietnamese don't want anything to do with China, and they don't trust Russia.
Yeah.
So as far as colonialism, I've done a lot of research. I suggest you look. Now, there's a lot of other mistakes took place in Vietnam throughout the war, but as far as the precipitation, as Patty said, we had no enemy in Southeast Asia. We actually had a friend. We actually had an ally. We actually had someone who wanted the United States to support them.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, 58,100, and depends, the numbers change periodically as they find new bodies, but 118, I believe it is, died in that war.
Yeah.
And to this day, I'm angered at it.
It's one of those things I've been doing a little research to get ready for this course. I've been listening to a book called The Best and the Brightest. I know it kind of takes one side for sure.
Sure it does.
But it goes over, and one of the recurring themes, you see this a little bit in Korea too, is that the United States had a bit of a tendency to try and push people out of State Department offices and positions in countries that they were actually familiar with. And they ended up with people in there that weren't familiar with those countries.
Now, if you want to read the other book that goes along with that will give you the other side of it, read H.R. McMaster, Dereliction of Duty.
Mm-hmm.
H.R. McMaster worked for the current president, got thrown out because he disagreed with some of the policies of the president. But H.R. McMaster's got his PhD, and his PhD thesis turned into Dereliction of Duty. He took the declassified documents, which showed the inner workings of the Pentagon and the inner workings of the State Department and the Department of Defense under Kennedy and under Johnson, leading up to it, and the interaction that took place, where they didn't listen to what was being said.
Yeah.
They didn't listen to each other, and they formed their opinions based on politics and expediency rather than based on the fact that we were going to lose so many people.
Yeah, domestic politics played a huge role in it because so many of these figures couldn't afford to be viewed as weak on communism.
I'm
or
not
weak on
suggesting
those
that you
issues.
don't read both sides by any stretch,
Yeah.
but read both sides.
Oh, for sure.
Robert McNamara and is talking about the fog of war, as well as the best and the brightest. And remember, McNamara got his chops under Kennedy, and he got it with the Cuban Missile Crisis because they ignored the advice of the military, and it was his Harvard training and using quantitative methods where they decided that the real risk was using a military solution, and that if they held their line with Khrushchev, that they would have been able to diffuse the situation because Russia would back down. And in fact, Russia blinked. And as a result, his ascendancy took place. They tried to do the same thing with Vietnam. And the fact is, it didn't work.
No.
And the biggest problem is they underestimated the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh early on used a metaphor and said that if you jump on the back of the tiger, you have to understand you have to get back off at some point. Well, we jumped on the back of the tiger, and the problem is we had no exit strategy. Not only that, he also said, and this is where our strategy differed from the Vietnamese, we went with a body count strategy. And Westmoreland had what was called the Friday Night Follies.
Mhm.
Every Friday night on the rooftop of the Rex Hotel, which is still there, by the way, in Saigon,
Yeah.
the press would gather for a military briefing, and that's where they would get the body counts for the week, and that's where they would get all their information about the damage that was being done. So we had a battle in so, and there were 3,000 Vietnamese killed, or NVA or VC, and there were 150 Americans. And then the next week it would be another one, and they would keep doing it, and the numbers were always skewed heavily.
Yeah.
A lot of those numbers were accurate because over 2 million North Vietnamese died during
That's
that
true.
war.
It was a
58,000.
tremendous loss of life.
But Ho Chi Minh said, we will continue to lose people. We will outlast you.
Mhm.
You will not outlast us. We never, we meaning the military and the power structure that were making the civilian authorities that were making the decisions, never understood the Vietnamese mindset.
Mhm.
They never understood our own mindset, that during the American Revolution, what America and what Americans were willing to endure in order for their own freedom. They didn't reckon with the fervor with which the Vietnamese would defend their own country. And
Yeah.
as a result, we lost way too many people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just one of those things, and it's true that in hindsight it can be a little easier to spot the warning signs, but there were many opportunities to like change course or do something a little differently. We came so close a few times, but we kept going forward.
Well, in 1968, when Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election, we were ecstatic
Mhm.
because we thought this was Johnson recognizing the futility of this war and that he was going to pull us out.
Mhm.
And that was his intent.
Yeah.
But Nixon had his own ideas for re-election
Mhm.
or for election because Johnson wasn't running and Humphrey was. But the way to run against him, he made it so that we couldn't pull out.
Yeah.
And as a result, we
Yeah.
stayed in.
Yes.
Somewhat fewer casualties after 1970,
Mhm.
but nonetheless, the number of casualties through 75 was still staggering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's really hard to get your head around. And I guess this sort of connects to what we were already talking about. But when you went to Vietnam initially, what was your view, if you had a view at all in the first place, of like the people that were making these policy decisions, that were making the decisions that put us in Vietnam, that was keeping us there at the time? What was your view of those people, or like the apparatus that did it?
When you go into the military, first thing you do before anything else,
Mhm.
while you're still in civilian clothes,
Mhm.
before you step foot onto an air base, an army base, a marine base,
Mhm.
is you stand usually like in downtown Pittsburgh at the Federal Building,
Mhm.
and you hold your right hand up and you say you swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States,
Yes.
and you swear an oath. And part of that oath is that you will follow the orders of your superiors.
Yes.
So when the Secretary of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense,
Mhm.
when they say jump, you say how high.
Yeah.
And that's what you're supposed to do. That's
Yeah.
what you swore an oath to do.
Mhm.
Mostly, though, for any military person that you'll meet, I would say that the very, very vast majority will say that number one, the part of the oath that they believe in most is to protect and defend the United States and
Yes.
the Constitution of the United States. And technically, once you're discharged, that oath is satisfied.
Mhm.
And most people that are veterans will tell you that oath is never satisfied. You are always under that oath.
Mhm. Yeah, and so basically, it's one of those things where it doesn't. Since you have that oath, it almost doesn't matter what your
You
opinion
didn't have any
is.
choice.
Like you just go with it.
You had no choice. You
and,
followed orders.
And I know you've almost already said this, but in your time since, you've gone back and you studied these
Absolutely.
things, and then so you definitely have an opinion now. Whereas
Well,
at the time you
I read
you
the
really
600
couldn't
the 600
afford to.
the 600 page biography of Ho Chi Minh.
Oh wow.
And it was written by a professor at Penn State. I've read A Dereliction of Duty. you know, I've read all of these, I've seen the Ken Burns series, I went back and I saw the Stanley Kamauer series that was done in 1970s, shortly after the war had ended, where a lot of these people were, where Ken Burns was using archival footage, a lot of these people were still alive and were being interviewed live and trying to defend their actions. But when you look even then, you see the folly, the not listening to one hand, not listening to the other, ignoring facts, which is why I get so upset when people, whether it be climate change, whether it be anti-vaxxing, whether it be, I don't care what it is, that just ignore facts. Facts are facts.
It's true.
One politician, I don't know, if you can't remember if it was Tip O'Neill or what, says, everybody is entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
Yeah.
Facts are facts.
That's a great quote.
And it is what it is. I mean, you can believe what you want to believe, but you have to still look at the facts of the matter. And if you do the research, if you read Dereliction of Duty, he's basing it on hard documentation that came out of the Pentagon.
Yeah, the Pentagon papers.
And McMaster is a general. He spent his career in the military, in the Marines.
Very committed.
He's not trashing the Joint Chiefs for the sake of trashing people who came before him.
No.
He's talking about bad decision making that was done on all parts throughout that engagement on what you should not do now, yet we're doing the same thing now in Iraq, Afghanistan,
Well, and
and Syria.
I feel like that's the key for someone like him too. When he goes ahead and does something like that, it's his intention to try and make sure these mistakes don't happen again.
Exactly.
It's not his intention to like tarnish the past or beat a dead horse or whatever.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
That's really tough. And then I guess this question again, these ones that we're getting to, we've kind of like touched a little bit. This is a little presumptuous,
No,
to be sure, but like if you had been the one to set the policy, I'm assuming your policy would have been rather different. And I know hindsight is hindsight, and it's a tough
Well, it depends on when.
question to ask, but
But it depends. If you were going to set the policy, you'd have to say when.
that's
If,
true.
if the policy is once we were already engaged, well, now you're already committed.
That's
And
that's a
now
very
you're
different
committed.
ballgame.
Now you're committed to supporting South Vietnam, even though it's a corrupt government. We never had a legitimately independent government in South Vietnam the whole time the war was perpetrated. You had a corrupt government in South Vietnam throughout. So decisions then would have been on a war footing on what it would take to win a war.
Yeah, and that was
If it would have been from the beginning, it would have been actually listening to the advisors like Archimedes Patty and possibly sitting down and getting with Ho Chi Minh.
yeah.
There's a famous quote of LBJ that said, if Uncle Ho and I could get together, we could resolve this thing in 2 weeks. And they never did.
Yeah.
And by the time 1965, 66, 67 rolled around, Ho Chi Minh was an old man.
Yeah.
He was already an old man in 45, but he was a very old man by then. His influence was waning, so he was not in charge of very much. And his hard line, like Le Duan, took over the party, and they were much more, quote, communist,
Well,
as opposed to Ho Chi Minh,
yeah.
who was socialist and would have been more amenable to working within the United States structure of democracy and how he approached it. The problem is we missed our chance by not even listening to our advisors to talk to him. Part of that is because the president at the time passed away. Because I believe that very possibly, not probably, but very possibly FDR would have been amenable to talking with Ho Chi Minh, and we would not have had this conflict. But instead, he died. Truman was influenced to listen to our, quote, ally in Charles de Gaulle in France, and as a result, we went down the path with him.
Yeah, and then like you had said, because we spurned them and they had to turn.
And George Hott at Way, they were three of the Iwo Jima, the Chosin Reservoir, and Way were three of the most deadly Marine engagements. And we have people from Western Pennsylvania that were in all three of them.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Pittsburgh area has a disproportionately high number of veterans.
Why do you think that is? Just because, I mean,
where we came from.
Yeah,
It's just
the
the family.
culture.
The family, I had my father, several uncles served in World War II.
Mhm.
All my friends had their parents served in World War II. I mean, it's what you did.
Yeah,
And now, in Vietnam, 10%. Now, granted, there was a draft,
yeah.
but in Vietnam, 10% ended up going to Vietnam. Ended up going into the service.
Hmm.
Now it's less than 1%.
Yeah, it's very limited now. I happen to know a few people that are in the military currently. Actually, two of them are brothers. So I mean, I like.
Well, if you would ever want, we're always trying to get civilians, people who are not military, to come to events. There's a hiatus during the winter, but starting up in March,
Hmm.
they'll start having events again. It's on the webpage.
Hmm.
You can see when they are. If there's one close by, if you're able to get there for a breakfast, now they tend to be in the mornings, usually
Mhm.
a Tuesday or a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Just come. You don't even have to go to breakfast. I mean, breakfast, usually there's a cost, like $12 for breakfast.
Yeah.
But you can come and just listen and not have breakfast,
Mhm.
and that doesn't cost a thing.
That's cool.
And Todd would, and just introduce yourself to Todd. He loves to have non-veterans come to
Mhm.
share the stories as well.
Yeah.
The other thing is we now have, because of the 9/11 vets, called them 9/11 vets, meaning anybody after 9/11.
Yeah.
The war on terror, the longest war is the other thing that's being called.
Hmm.
We have events in the evening, and they tend to be beer events. So they're like at Spoonwood Brewery, Voodoo Brewery. They're at places like that where they'll have, you pay for your own beer or whatever you're drinking, and then they have pizza and stuff. And it's where a lot of the younger vets are able to make it because they can't come during the day because they're still working.
Yeah.
But they come, and the older vets will also come
Hmm.
and support them. But it's a chance for them to tell their story.
Hmm.
And as we've always said, and I know a number of them, a number of the younger vets, tell them all the time, said, look, this is a chance for you to open up now and not carry that with you,
Yeah.
festering for 30, 40, 50 years like Vietnam vets did.
Yeah.
Because we came back, and the reason we shut down is we were not accepted.
Yeah. It wasn't something people wanted to talk about.
Well, not just didn't want to talk about it, they wanted to vilify you for it. They wanted
Yeah.
to call you names. They wanted to take out their anger and their frustrations on the veterans.
Hmm.
So you just shut up and you didn't say anything and hunkered down and lived your life. You want the current vets not to have to go through that. And
That's
the
true.
Vietnam, and they will tell you that the Vietnam vets are the first ones to try to make sure that they're acclimated and
Hmm.
try to make sure that they support them.
Yeah.
Because we know what we went through, we don't want them to go through the same thing. So it's like therapy. If you can open up, if you can share your feelings, if you can share that story, it makes it so that you can much more easily open up and get
Mhm.
and heal.
Yeah.
Where it's harder if you just hold it in. There's still a lot of guys that I know that are still bitter,
Hmm.
and they haven't done the research, they haven't done the history, they don't want to know.
Yeah.
They're angry, they're still angry, but they're angry at different things. Sometimes they're angry at the protesters. They'll still be completely angry at anybody that protested.
Hmm.
Andy, who had been injured, he joined Vietnam Vets Against the War.
Hmm.
I mean, he protested.
Hmm.
And I remember one of my other friends was saying, I just have no sympathy. I just hate the protesters. And he was asked the question, "What about Andy?" And he was severely injured in combat. And after he got healed, he became active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And Ed's answer was, he earned it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't get more of a justification or more of a powerful justification for an anti-war protest than somebody who's actually participated in it.
And that's why, whether you believe in his politics or not, it's totally irrelevant to me. But when John Kerry gets vilified for protesting,
Hmm.
he had the right. He had been there.
Hmm.
He had done that.
Yeah.
So whether you agree with him or not, he had the right to do that.
Yeah.
And the old slogan, "My country, right or wrong," no. You have the right to question.
Yeah.
Now, when you're in the military and you're given a direct order, you follow the order.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean you have to agree with the order,
Yeah.
and if you feel it's immoral, you have a right to disobey the order at that
Mhm.
point. But you also recognize the consequences of those actions.
Yes.
But that's why it's so important that I think that you try to get all sides and you
Yes.
do more research.
Mm-hmm.
I have, like I said, I have some friends that they are just adamant. I have other, I have a number of friends that said I'd never go back to Vietnam, never. And then they heard about our trip and said, you know, maybe. I think, and one of them just said, yeah, I'm scheduling a trip, I'm going back.
Nice.
He never thought he would, and then he is when he heard about how he felt about it. So the exhibit that starts here in April
Mm-hmm.
on Vietnam,
Yeah.
Breakfast Club's going to be heavily involved. There are going to be a number of panels in the evening,
Okay. Cool.
and including in June, they're supposed to have a documentary on our trip.
Cool. Oh yeah. Are they gonna do that? Are they gonna show
That'll
that
be
here? That stuff was
That'll be
important.
here. It'll be upstairs on the 5th floor.
Yeah.
That Breakfast Club has had two other events. One was should they reinstitute the draft,
Mm-hmm.
just a discussion,
Yeah.
and they had another women in the military, and women from World War II up to the current day.
Yeah.
Military, and a discussion of their service and what it's like and what their feelings are. There'll be other programs that'll be here, and particularly during Vietnam, there's going to be a number of others that
Yeah.
are going to be up here.
I'm looking forward to that. I hope they'll get the chance to do some gallery host with that, and maybe do some of the other events connected
Absolutely,
with it.
absolutely.
Um,
And like I said, if I would suggest if you have the time, talk to Todd DiPastino and look at the Veterans Breakfast Club. If you come to an event, evening or morning,
Mhm.
come listen. It's just fascinating what you'll hear in the 2 hours or so.
Yeah. And then we touched on this a little bit already, but is there a single positive takeaway or multiple positive takeaways from for you, or do you think that the nation had any positive takeaways from Vietnam? Like, not just to focus on the negatives that came out of it, but was there silver lining for us or for you?
The only silver lining that I have as a result of the war is having gone back and seeing how the country has rebounded.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they do not hate Americans, that they actually like Americans, that they separate the war from us. They look at the war as the war.
Mm-hmm.
We have, if you come to, if they do the documentary, there's a clip. We've seen one little snippet of what they're going to be using.
Yeah.
When we were at the DMZ,
Mm-hmm.
we were at the museum at the DMZ, and Andy, the vet who had been injured,
Mm-hmm.
several of us had already moved farther out. We had left the museum and started towards the bridge. And Andy was leaving, and this Vietnamese gentleman, older gentleman, saw him and came over to him and didn't really speak English, but he looked at him and he pointed to his mouth. And Andy still has some disfigurement in the corner of his mouth, and he went, "War." And Andy shook his head and said, "Yes." And they were able to communicate with each other. He had fought for the North Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
Andy fought against the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
And he pulled up his pant leg and showed wounds on his leg that he had suffered and wounds on his side.
Uh-huh.
And he just looked at him and embraced and started crying and saying, "Why? Why did we do this?"
Yeah.
And that was the question. Everybody walked away and said, "Why?" And another of the vets who came along, he now lives in California, but he's originally from here.
Mm-hmm.
He says, in what's going to be in the documentary, he said, "Why indeed?" He said, he was only doing what he was being asked to do.
Yeah.
His country said, "Come and fight."
Mhm.
He did what he did. Our
Yeah.
country said, "Come and fight." And we did what we were supposed to.
Yeah.
How can you hate him for that?
Yeah. It's something that you didn't have a lot of choice in, really.
But that's a silver lining, if there is one. From my military service, I'm proud that I served my country.
Yeah.
I'd do it again.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that military service is a worthy endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel otherwise. I
Mhm.
feel that it is something that you should do.
Yeah.
I believe that everybody, male and female, between 17 and 22 should do 2 years of service of some kind.
Yeah.
And that service can be in a hospital, it could be in some other volunteer type,
Mm-hmm.
you know. they should do something for the benefit of the country,
Yeah.
because it doesn't have to be military by any stretch of the imagination, but freedom isn't cheap. You have to pay for it,
Yeah.
and you have to do something. So whether it was like a project like the FDR's WPDA projects, something like that, where you actually do something for the benefit of the country, or you work with elderly, or you work with disabled, or you work with mentally ill, or
Yeah.
you do something for the good of the country. They do that in Israel,
Yes.
and we should do it here. It gives you a better appreciation of what freedom is about, rather than taking an advantage.
Well, it's one
And
of
I think
those.
most people take it for advantage.
Yeah, it's one of those things like when you have involvement in something, or where you feel involvement or connection or like an ownership of something, you care about it more. And if you don't establish that, then it's not something you're going to think about as much.
Yeah.
And then again, this is something we talked about a little bit, and this cuts directly to it. But do you feel like the United States government, at least on some level, failed the soldiers in the field who ended up being
Absolutely.
there? Because
Absolutely.
they ended up in a conflict that probably didn't need to happen. That,
Not only that, the biggest thing is we didn't understand our enemy.
Mhm.
I'll give you a couple examples. There was an article that was written for a military magazine. It's called Military Arrogance and Military Ignorance and Military Arrogance.
Mhm.
And it tells a couple of very pointed stories that happened during Vietnam. In one case, it played coup, and that was an Army and Air Force base in the Central Highlands. All of the bases had Vietnamese who came on base during the day and did various jobs. They cleaned your hooch where you slept. Now they got paid. I mean, we had two Papa Sans came in and they cleaned our hooch, and we all pitched in a certain amount, and that paid them for them to come in, clean it up. Do it. We'd pay them extra if they would do laundry for us, if they would, rather than us do it. They also did all sorts of other jobs. Well, one of the jobs was burning classified material. And there was a Vietnamese woman who they never investigated whether she could speak English or not, number one. How well she could read English. They didn't know that she had a photographic memory. She read every one of those classified documents before she burned them, and she passed it on. And they had an attack on the base where they snuck in underground, because they also had, and they attacked throughout by using that military intelligence. They had another base down in the Chu Chi tunnel area where they had 3 guys come on base every morning on a bicycle with their lunches. And they left them on the base, and then they cut hair all day. And they gave haircuts. They were barbers. They gave haircuts. And at lunchtime, they would eat their lunch by themselves, and they would walk around. But they didn't. And then every day when they left, they were searched to see if they were taking anything from the base.
Yeah.
Our arrogance was that these were ignorant barbers. Our lack of intelligence was that every day they came in, they had explosives in their bicycle down the tubes that during lunchtime they would surreptitiously take out and hide. And as they walked around, they were pacing off the distance between points so that when the major attack came, they knew exactly where to attack, and they had tunnels that came up underneath the base. The night of the attack, they never left. They got into the tunnel. So when the attack came out, they came out, the explosives were already on the base, and they helped to blow up things within the base, and they never knew what was happening. And it's because they never understood the enemy. They never understood those guys.
Yeah.
There was another, and the guy who wrote the article was he would put up the telephone lines, wires that would connect the communication lines between units. And there were 12 channels on the line. And he wondered why his unit was never attacked, because the communication line would be something you would want to attack all the time.
Yeah.
Yet his was never attacked. They found out later that it was because 11 of the lines were used by the military. The 12th line was used by the South Vietnamese Army. And the South Vietnam Army was so infiltrated by Viet Cong that they were using the intelligence on that line in order to gain all the intelligence on what was going on. So they didn't want the communication to go down because it would knock out their own communication line.
Huh.
That's the arrogance and the ignorance that took place. And that's where the military let us down. That's where the military went into the body count as opposed to a more reasonable and more consequential way of waging that war. They would send the Marines or the Army. They sent them up to Dak To. They sent them up Hamburger Hill. They attacked mountaintops. Bloody battles. At the end of the battle, what would happen? They'd leave. They had no strategic purpose.
Yeah.
Why were they taking them in the first place?
Yeah.
There was no reason. It wasn't like World War II where you would take a town, occupy the town, and that became a base of operation. Oh no, you go out to Hill 685 and bloody battle, and the next thing you know, you leave.
Yeah,
Case on. The siege of Case on. When it ended, the Marines left. Army came in. Nothing was there. The Vietnamese ended up leaving.
Yeah.
They went. Where did they go? They just left.
Yeah.
And then they left and they abandoned it.
Yeah, that's kind of like I was in my research on Korea, Pork Chop Hill. That was toward the end of the Korean War. At that point, there wasn't a real. I mean, there was some strategic significance to that position, but they traded back and forth. And what they were really fighting for was leverage in whatever negotiations were going
That's
on.
exactly right.
Which, I mean, I guess it had its purpose, but it wasn't like you said. It wasn't like you take this, it helps for the next step.
When they instituted Rolling Thunder, and they sent the planes in on Rolling Thunder, they were surprised at the anti-aircraft that was going on, and the fact that we started having planes shot down, and all of a sudden we had people being put into prison. And the reason for that was simple. And the same thing happened during the Christmas bombings of Hanoi, where B-52s were being shot down. And that's incredible because they fly really high. And they were shooting down multiple B-52s. And part of the reason, what normal military practice is before you start bombing raids, is you attack the command and control structures. You knock out all the radar, all the anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah.
The reason we didn't, Russians were being deployed as advisors. And if we knocked out the anti-aircraft guns and we knocked out the radar, we would have been killing Russians and Russia would have gotten involved. As a result, they didn't do it and they were shooting down our own planes. So they were sending those guys knowingly into a harmful situation where there was a better than even chance that they were going to be shot down.
Yeah, I mean, because that's
that's dereliction of duty.
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of some of those high altitude bombers. But if you still have the radar and some of those installations up, it kind of negates.
I never believed until I actually saw in one of the lakes in Hanoi part of a B-52 that was shot down during the Christmas bombings.
Wow.
They were B-52s, not just the A4s or the F-100s or the F-4 Phantoms that were low flying and were able to be targeted. Oh no, we're talking B-52 bombers.
Yeah, those are really high. I mean, like, that's crazy. So then for 10, are there any connections that you made during the war? Like, were there people that you served with during the war, or people that you met during or prior to the war that you're still connected to now? Like, did you establish any lifelong connections there? Because I know, like you said, you kind of shut down on it afterward. Did that cut all those ties, or have you reconnected? Or?
It cut the ties with the people I served with. Although I about 6 months ago got in contact with a guy that I served with, and all of my photographs and stuff got burned in a fire, so I had none of them left. I ended up, when I found out about the Security Police Association, I got in contact with this guy who had taken a lot of photographs, and I got photographs of the base that I never had before. And he lives out in eastern Pennsylvania, and we did reconnect. The connection is now more in the last 5 years, 6 years, where I've been going to the Breakfast Club and some of the other organizations, and getting to know other guys that served during the same time period, same branch, different branch. I haven't met any other security police because there weren't as many of us.
Yeah, that's kind of a little bit more.
It was a bit more of a specialty, although I did meet a woman at one event who was in tears because her husband had been Ton Sanuk, security police.
Uh-huh.
And he had always told her about people not understanding what we did.
Yeah.
And he died, and I'm not sure what he died from, but he passed away, and she was so taken that she had met somebody else who was like him, had served in the same kind of a unit as him, and talked about it, and brought attention to the fact that we were kind of the light infantry of the Air Force,
Yeah.
and people didn't realize it.
Mhm.
And she was really, really emotional as a result of our meeting.
Yeah.
So I mean, those kind of things matter. And then meeting people like Ray and Andy, and I can go on and on about these guys, and many of them will be involved here at the History Center for
Yeah.
the exhibit that's coming up.
Mhm.
But they've become extremely close friends.
Yeah. And then for the last question, we kind of talked about this a little bit, your views on the current condition of Vietnam, and I'm sure how your experiences there have permanently affected how you view the region. Like, you now have a tie there you would not have otherwise had.
A tie from 50 years ago, and then a tie having gone back and seen what they've done.
Yeah.
If you go to the old parts of the city of Hanoi,
Mhm.
if you go to the countryside, the small towns in the country, they don't look much different than they did 50 years ago.
Mhm.
I mean, they're still a lot of the same, living pretty much the same way. They still are an agricultural country,
Yeah.
growing fruits, rice, huge rice population, but they are industrializing. They they are building. You get to cities like Da Nang,
Mhm.
in some parts of Hanoi, Saigon, Phu Bai. They're getting much more metropolitan. People, the internet is wide open.
Yeah.
Everybody has a cell phone now.
Uh-huh.
They're able to have access to the internet, and it's unfettered. It's not censored. The Communist Party is losing its grip.
Yeah.
It's starting to, it's not as hardline,
Mhm.
and the southern part of the country is still very much different than the northern part.
Oh, really?
It's still very different. It's much more metropolitan, much more westernized,
Okay.
and they're driving the country because that's
Yeah.
where a lot of the economy's coming,
Mhm.
where the businesses are going, and a lot of other things are happening. We met three people up near the DMZ, and one young lady was from Saigon,
Mhm.
and she lives now, I think she works in the Philippines, but had been back visiting.
Mhm.
And they wanted their pictures taken with us and to talk with us. And she said that she thinks that within 10 years, Vietnam will be a democracy.
That's pretty cool to hear.
It was cool to see that the people did not look at us as an enemy. They didn't look at us as a negative. They were extremely friendly. They wanted to talk. So knowing that they are on the right track,
Mhm.
and that they are still really wonderful people, makes me feel really good.
Mhm.
And it does give me a connection back to that country. It is a beautiful country.
Yeah.
Always was, still is, but it still needs a lot of help. I mean,
Yeah.
we did some tremendous damage there.
Mhm.
We dropped more ordnance in Quang Tri province, one small province up near the DMZ, than were dropped in all of World War II in Germany.
That's-
Imagine that.
That's just one of those like the statistics you hear. That's just kind of mind blowing.
Well, the other mind-blowing part is 10% of all the ordnance dropped never exploded.
That's not great.
And a lot of that has now been disarmed because 50 years has gone by.
Yes.
But they still find unexploded ordnance.
Oh yeah.
And I met a young man, spent a lot of time talking with him, when he, about 18 years ago, he's 28 now, he was 10 years old, he found this little metal ball with his cousins. And they picked it up and started to play with it. They had no idea what it was a cluster bomb. And when they threw it onto the ground, it exploded. His two cousins were killed, he lost both legs, part of one arm up to the elbow and two fingers on the other hand, plus he lost about 80% of his eyesight.
Wow.
He now has prosthetics that he walks with. He uses a cane on the other arm, and he's got a degree in computer science, and he works with this mine museum, educating kids on if they find things, what to do and how they should notify people and what not to touch,
Yeah.
etc. All these unexploded ordnance.
Mhm.
Most of it's gone, although when they go to other parts of the area where nobody's developed or dug or whatever,
Mhm.
they will find parts of this, and they still have to have it disarmed
Yeah.
because it's still there.
Yeah.
And Agent Orange, third generation Agent Orange, because there's still Agent Orange in the water
Yeah.
and in the soil.
Yeah.
And
That's,
that we did that to them.
yes. There's still repercussions that have to be sorted out. Just some of those like long-term things that aren't necessarily intended and aren't thought about that often, but definitely have.
But there's
effect.
also short term. Agent Orange used an Operation Ranch Hand. It took years for the government to admit what the devastating effects of Agent Orange was.
Mhm.
It took years to admit who might be affected.
Mhm.
Not just people who might have been where they sprayed, but how about where it was stored? How about where it was flown from? You know, they found that people were exposed in all sorts of things, including myself. Our base had Agent Orange.
Mhm.
Fast forward to today. In Iraq and Afghanistan, they have burn pits.
Mhm.
Those burn pits are these enormous pits that they burn everything, anything and everything on the base that they don't want and they need to get rid of.
Uh-huh.
They don't have trash places, so they throw them in the burn pits and they burn. The carcinogenics and the repercussions of the fumes from those burn pits
Mhm.
are really devastating today's veterans.
Mhm.
And the government isn't acknowledging it.
Yeah.
And it's happening again. This happened 50 years ago with Agent Orange. It's happening now, and they still don't want to fess up to it.
Yeah.
That's where the anger comes in and the frustration comes in. If you're going to have people go into harm's way, you've got to protect them.
Mhm.
You've got to support them, and you've got to protect them, and you've got to take care of them afterwards
Yeah.
if you've done things to harm them.
Yeah.
And we've done things to harm our current vets, and I'm angry that those folks who have been involved, and I know a lot of the vets, they weren't heavily close to it, but they knew the burn pits, they've seen them, they experienced them. The effects of that's going to happen to these guys and women now, years later,
Yeah.
it's a responsibility that we've got, yet you hear it and all they want to do is talk about the money. Oh, there's not enough money to do this or not enough money to do that. If you're going to put people in harm's way, by God, you take care of them.
Yeah. And be honest with them too.
Yeah, and honesty, the books that you're reading, I seriously suggest looking at Dereliction of Duty,
Yes.
H.R. McMaster's.
Yeah.
It's all based, I mean, probably a third of the book is his footnotes. I mean, this was his PhD
Yeah.
thesis.
Yeah.
This was not a, let's whip off this book for some money. Oh,
Very
no.
heavily researched.
Yeah, he's a PhD.
Yeah.
And H.R. McMaster is not one of my most favorite people, let me tell you.
Mhm.
But I respect what he did in terms of writing that book and what he tried to do by being part of an administration that he disagreed with aspects of and ended up getting fired as a result of it.
Yeah.
He stood up for his principles.
Mhm.
Whether you like him or dislike him,
Mhm.
he stood up for his principle and he was standing up for the veterans, he was standing up for the military troops, he was standing up so that you didn't end up doing just what they're doing now.
Yeah.
And that's the scary part,
Yeah.
that it still exists today.
Well, I mean, that was the last question. I would like just give an opportunity now. If there's anything that you feel like I haven't addressed that you'd like to bring up, this is an opportunity.
I think I've waxed poetic on too much as it is.
I mean,
But it became, as a result of opening up the lid
mhm,
that had been on for 50 years, 45 years.
mhm,
I ended up getting in contact with the military and got my medals and ribbons reissued, and I have them displayed.
mhm,
I participate in a number of things. There's going to be a symposium. I think it's next month at Duquesne.
mhm,
We participated last year. We're going to do it again this year.
mhm.
I'll sit and talk about it if people ask. I've got to do things. I spoke at Memorial Day celebration 2 years in a row now.
Mhm.
Didn't do any of that for a long time.
Yeah.
I think most veterans will tell you they're proud of their service, they're proud of what they've done.
Mhm.
There's some anger for the things that we don't do properly that we should,
Yeah.
but that that this country owes a debt of gratitude for those who are serving today.
Yes.
They need to be respected.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like being told thank you for your service.
Mm-hmm.
It makes them uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable. Veterans uncomfortable. We understand why people say it,
Mm-hmm.
but it makes us uncomfortable by hearing it.
Yeah.
But they want to be respected,
Yeah.
and they need to be respected because they deserve that.
Mm-hmm.
And they deserve. They're not looking for handouts. They're looking for what they've earned.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put them in harm's way and you've done things, you don't go through combat without some PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be a small amount or, I know guys 50 years later still have PTSD. They still have symptoms.
Yeah.
But almost everybody I know had problems sleeping, had night terrors or nightmares, had anger issues, and some very, very, very severe. But you don't go through that kind of thing without some level of PTSD.
Yeah.
And some of the current vets,
Mm-hmm.
some of the guys women and guys that I know now, they don't always want to admit it, but they'll say, yeah, I mean, it's tough. And we're getting a hold of it and trying to deal with it.
Yeah.
But it's something that as American citizens, you need to think about and do something about,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just expect that somebody in Congress who doesn't do squat, because they tend to only want to get reelected,
Yeah.
both parties,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not picking on anybody special,
Yeah.
both parties, they should be thinking of, the people who are keeping them safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes first responders as well, but the people who go into the military, it's not an easy thing to ask.
Mhm.
It's not an easy ask.
Yeah. It's one of those things, like if you have the opportunity to vote for somebody you think will actually help, or if you see a bill that's going through that could help, that sort of thing, you definitely get on it.
You have a responsibility in a democracy. You have to. It's a participatory sport.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a spectator sport.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, too much of our population sits out elections.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 50% vote, maybe.
Yeah.
Usually not.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
It's usually not. And
Yeah.
on off-year elections, it's down in the 30s.
Oh.
I mean, give me a break. It should be almost mandatory.
Oh, I know.
How do you get to complain if you don't take the action to vote? And if you vote, you should do some research to figure out who you're voting for.
Yeah.
You don't vote for a D or an R. You vote for the individual and what their positions are,
Yeah.
regardless of what party affiliation they have.
Yeah. I know you were talking about voter attendance. I've worked our polls in our local precinct a few times, and especially like you said in the off years, the attendance
Oh, it's
percentage
terrible.
is really bad.
Oh, it's terrible.
And like for a small precinct like ours, it means like 100, 200 people in
I
an
think
entire day.
I think it was Tip O'Neill
Like-
that said all politics is local. When you come right down to it, it's local issues. It's issues that affect you.
Mhm.
If you're a man and you don't have children, then abortion may or may not be an issue.
Mhm.
If you're a woman, obviously abortion becomes an issue.
Mhm.
And then other people take up issues and decide, and they go all up and down over an issue without ever researching it.
Yeah.
And they we've got to legislate it. Well, what about legislating freedoms?
Mhm.
You can go on all sorts of things, but learning facts, getting facts, not just reading whatever liberal broadcast or document or conservative broadcast or document.
Mhm.
Read them both.
Yeah.
Take a look at all the sides. Take a
Yeah.
look at what's really going on. Yeah, are they parroting the same thing over and over? And then it's probably bullshit.
Mhm.
If they're actually giving some facts, I tend to look at things like some of the European news with the internet. It's great because you can get almost anything.
Yeah.
But I look at NPR because they tend to be more objective.
Mhm. Yeah.
They like to be painted as liberal, but they tend to be more objective, and
Yeah.
they bring on both sides of an issue.
Mhm.
They're not trying to sway you as only one side.
Mhm.
So, that's an important thing to do, and I think the country's really got to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I mean,
Not a
this has been
problem,
great.
Seth.